Christmas at my mother's house had always been about appearances. The matching plates, the carefully folded napkins, the way my mom, Susan, insisted everyone arrive at the same time, like we were props in a photo she planned to hang somewhere later. That year, I almost didn't go. I had worked a double shift the day before, slept barely 4 hours, and spent the entire drive rehearsing small talk in my head. I already knew how the night would end. A comment, a joke, a smile that cut just deep enough to remind me where I stood. Susan hugged me at the door, stiff and quick, already looking past my shoulder to see who was next. Dinner went smoothly at first. Wine poured. Laughter rose. My cousins compared jobs, houses, vacations. Susan nodded proudly at the right moments, soaking it all in like proof she'd done something right. Then came dessert. Susan tapped her glass with a spoon, smiling wide. "Before we eat," she said, "I just want to say how grateful I am. Especially for children who've really made something of themselves." Her eyes slid to my brother, then to my cousin, then, finally, landed on me. She laughed softly. "And Emily, well, we all bloom at different speeds, don't we?" The room went quiet. I smiled, because that's what I'd learned to do. Susan didn't know it yet, but that smile was the last gift she'd ever get from me. The laughter came back slowly, awkwardly, like people weren't sure they were allowed to enjoy themselves again. Someone made a joke about the pie getting cold. Forks scraped plates. Conversation restarted, but something had shifted. I felt it in my chest. Susan acted as if nothing had happened. She complimented the dessert she'd ordered from a bakery across town, talked about how hard it was to find quality these days, and asked my aunt if her neighbor's son was still doing that tech thing. No one looked at me. That was the part that always hurt more than the words. Not the insult itself, but how easily everyone adjusted around it. Like it was normal. Like I was expected to absorb it quietly and move on. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I stared at my reflection longer than I meant to. I didn't look like a failure. I looked tired, worn down, smaller than I used to be. When I came back out, Susan was already telling a story about how worried she was about my future, shaking her head with theatrical concern. She loved that tone, the one that made her sound generous while cutting me apart. I sat down, said nothing, and finished my coffee. What Susan didn't know was that the story she was telling wasn't hers to tell anymore. And the future she was worried about wasn't mine. Not after what I'd already seen in writing. Not after what I'd already decided to do. But I let her talk. For now. I left early that night. I said I had work in the morning. Susan barely looked up when I grabbed my coat. She waved dismissively, already deep in conversation with my uncle, her laughter sharp and performative. It was like my presence had been a formality she'd checked off. The drive home was quiet. No music, just the sound of tires against the road and Susan's words looping in my head. We all bloom at different speeds. She'd said it like a kindness. Like patience. What she never acknowledged was how much I'd already given up to keep her comfortable. I'd moved back after Dad died. I'd delayed promotions. I'd handled paperwork she said was too stressful. I'd signed documents she told me were routine, necessary, temporary. Every time I asked questions, she smiled and said, "Trust me, Emily. I'm your mother." And I had. That night, I opened the folder I kept at the back of my desk drawer. The one I hadn't touched in months. Inside were copies, emails, forms, confirmations, things I'd started saving when something first felt off. At the top was a letter I hadn't fully read when it arrived. I remembered thinking it was just another notice. Another formality my mom had asked me to forward to her. I read it properly for the first time. Halfway through the second page, my hands started shaking. Susan hadn't just been speaking out of arrogance at Christmas. She'd been speaking out of ignorance, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small at all. The letter was dated almost a year earlier. I remembered the day it arrived because Susan had called me the moment it hit the mailbox. She'd been unusually cheerful, telling me not to worry about it, saying it was just another update from the estate office. She'd asked me to scan it and send it over, the way I always did. I had. Then I'd filed the hard copy away without reading past the first paragraph. Now, sitting at my kitchen table, I read every line. The language was dry, precise, legal in a way that didn't invite emotion. But buried in the middle was a clause that stopped me cold. A clarification of authority. A condition tied to oversight. A sentence that quietly contradicted everything my mom had been presenting as fact. She didn't have the control she thought she had. Not fully. Not anymore. I checked the signature at the bottom. Then the reference number. Then the contact information. It was legitimate. Real. Verified. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry, though I was, but because something else had taken its place. Focus. The kind that sharpens your thoughts instead of blurring them. Susan had built her confidence on assumptions. On my silence. On the belief that I'd never look closely enough to challenge her. By morning, I knew two things for certain. First, she had no idea what she'd exposed by humiliating me so publicly. Second, I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. People like her never change when they're warned. They only change when they're corrected, formally, quietly, and in writing. The next few weeks passed the way they always had, on the surface. Susan called me regularly, usually to complain. About my brother not visiting enough. About paperwork she claimed was never-ending. About how exhausting it was to be the one holding everything together. I listened. I agreed when agreement was easier than arguing. She never mentioned Christmas. She never apologized. That silence told me more than any words could have. I started paying closer attention to how often she redirected conversations away from specifics, to how quickly she dismissed questions with humor, to how confidently she spoke about decisions that weren't actually hers to make. One afternoon, she forwarded me an email and asked me to handle it. That was her phrase, short, commanding, familiar. I opened the attachment and felt my stomach tighten. It referenced the same authority clause from the letter. Susan had replied as if she had full control. She didn't. I drafted a neutral response, just like she'd trained me to do. Polite, professional, non-confrontational. But this time, before sending it, I saved a copy. Then another. I began building a timeline. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my brother. Not my aunt. Not even the lawyer whose name I kept seeing at the bottom of official correspondence. Susan thought Christmas had been a performance she'd won. What she didn't know was that she'd reminded me, very publicly, why I needed to stop playing my assigned role. And I was done pretending I didn't see the strings. A week later, I received a text from my mom, Susan. Short. Casual. Are you coming over tomorrow? I need your help with the decorations. I paused before replying. Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to pretend I didn't care. But I typed back, sure, I'll be there around 2. When I arrived, the house smelled of cinnamon and pine. Everything sparkled. Christmas music played softly in the background. Susan smiled when she saw me, too wide, too rehearsed. As I hung ornaments on the tree, she chatted about her perfect holiday plan, mentioning neighbors who were bringing gifts, a Christmas dinner, and her surprise for everyone. I nodded politely. Inside, I was calculating. Timing. Placement. Opportunities. Evidence. Then she laughed, glancing at a small stack of envelopes on the counter. I made sure all the gifts are addressed properly this year. No mix-ups like last time. I smiled back. My hands kept working, but my mind raced. Each envelope, each carefully labeled package, each minor detail was a trap Susan had set to show off control. But control was an illusion. Exactly 48 hours later, she would realize that the illusion was about to crumble. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to act yet. The scene she thought she had staged was just the opening act. And I had all the lines memorized. That night, I stayed up late, reviewing the Christmas list Susan had carelessly left on the kitchen table. Each gift, each note, each recipient was catalogued. Names, addresses, even preferences. She had assumed her perfect plan would go unnoticed, that her little world of control would remain untouched. But she didn't know yet that I had been planning for months. Every small humiliation she'd inflicted, the snide comments about my decorating skills, the public ridicule at last year's family dinner, the way she made me feel invisible, had been logged in my mind like a meticulous ledger. I smiled quietly, sipping my tea. The pieces were in place. My father's old ledger, the letters Susan had accidentally dropped last month, the subtle inconsistencies in her so-called perfect invitations, they were all ammunition. I had to wait. Patience was the ultimate weapon. She thrived on immediacy, on attention, on reaction. I thrived in shadows, in preparation, in silence. By the time she noticed, it would be too late. And the look on her face when she realized every single carefully orchestrated detail had been rewritten under my hands. That smile wouldn't last a minute. I turned off the light, letting the quiet settle over the house. The storm was coming, and she had no idea it was already inside. The next morning, I acted normal, too normal. Susan greeted me with her usual forced cheer, showing off the perfect tree she'd stayed up all night finishing. "Didn't expect you to help," she said, her voice dripping with that smug superiority I knew so well. "I didn't want to ruin the surprise," I said with a soft smile, carefully neutral, hiding the satisfaction simmering inside. She didn't notice, of course. She never did. While she fussed over ornaments, I quietly retrieved my hidden folder from the office. It contained copies of receipts, letters, and emails she had carelessly overlooked, proof of her manipulations and tiny betrayals over the years. Financial favoritism, secret plans, subtle lies, everything was documented, dated, and cross-checked. Exactly 48 hours later, I would reveal it all. But not yet. I needed her to stay oblivious, to continue believing her perfect Christmas would play out like a movie. Every overconfident gesture she made, every laugh she tossed at me, only fueled the plan further. I even helped her place the last ornament on the tree, standing back to admire it with a polite nod. She glowed, expecting gratitude or awe. What she didn't know was that this very tree, this perfect display, would be the backdrop for the ultimate reveal. And when she finally saw the truth, she would wish she had never underestimated me. By mid-afternoon, the house was buzzing with family arriving for Christmas. My mom floated around, directing everyone with her usual flair, making sure every compliment landed on her meticulously wrapped gifts. I smiled and chatted, but every laugh I gave was measured, every step calculated. While Susan was distracted with her extended family, I slipped away to the study. The folder was already ready, the envelopes addressed. Each contained evidence she couldn't ignore, financial statements, receipts of her secret spending from the joint account, and letters proving she had intentionally excluded me from family decisions for years. I paused, imagining her face when she opened them. She had mocked me, belittled me, and paraded her perfect life as if I had no right to anything. She didn't realize yet how much patience I had, how long I had waited. Then came my favorite part of the plan: timing. I tucked the first envelope under the Christmas tree near her gifts, where she would reach first. The rest went into carefully chosen locations that would ensure maximum visibility during the evening. No screaming, no chaos, just quiet devastation. Susan's laugh echoed from the living room as I returned to the party, folding my hands calmly. She didn't know yet. And when the first envelope was discovered, her world would start to unravel, minute by minute, gift by gift, and revelation by revelation. Dinner began, everyone seated, laughter filling the air. Susan was radiant, the center of attention, holding court over family anecdotes and jokes. I stayed calm, sipping my wine, carefully watching her reactions. Someone reached for a gift beneath the tree, the first envelope I had placed. Curiosity sparked. She casually picked it up, expecting a card, a note of gratitude, or perhaps a last-minute ornament. But as her fingers unfolded the papers, her smile faltered. Her eyes widened. The chatter around the table dimmed as she tried to process what she was seeing. Receipts, letters, statements, every carefully hidden betrayal she had orchestrated was now undeniable. She tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow. I could feel the room's energy shifting, the weight of justice settling quietly like a snowflake. And then she realized I had prepared the rest, all meticulously timed. Each envelope was a ticking clock. She didn't know yet, but by the end of the evening, she would have no control left. Susan moved nervously to hide the envelope, but the family had already noticed. Whispers began to ripple across the table. I leaned back, hands crossed, maintaining calm. Each revelation I had prepared hit harder than the last. I could see her mind racing. How had I discovered everything? How had I managed to gather this evidence quietly, without her noticing? Her confidence, her arrogance, the way she had flaunted her perfect holiday, it all began to crumble. Exactly 48 hours later, I had ensured every piece of correspondence, every financial statement, and even a few unexpected witnesses were ready to confirm my account. By the time the evening ended, Susan would be forced into silent admission, her public facade shattered without me saying a word. Her arrogance had been her undoing. I didn't gloat. I simply watched, letting her panic slowly spread. The quiet devastation was far more satisfying than any shouting match or confrontation could have been. After dinner, family gathered around the tree to open presents. Susan's attention was drawn to the pile near her meticulously wrapped gifts. She tried to mask it, but I saw the tremor in her hands as she picked up the next envelope. This can't be right," she whispered, flipping through the papers. Everyone's eyes followed her. I sat nearby, serene, watching as realization dawned. The betrayal she thought she had buried for years was now exposed for all to see. I had anticipated her every move. Her smile lasted less than a minute as she struggled to compose herself. Every whispered accusation she had leveled at me, every time she tried to make me feel small, was now laid bare, documented and undeniable. By the end of the evening, Mom's Christmas performance, her carefully curated image of control, would collapse completely. And when the final envelope was discovered, it would not be a scene of chaos, but one of quiet, irreversible justice. The room was quiet, but the tension was electric. Susan clutched the final envelope, her fingers trembling as if it might bite her. She glanced around, searching for an ally, but every pair of eyes was fixed on her. The smug confidence she wore all year, her silent assertion that she controlled every corner of our lives, was cracking before my eyes. She can't just take this," she stammered, voice barely audible over the crackle of the fireplace. I leaned back slightly, serene, letting the moment stretch. "It's all here," I said softly, nodding toward the envelope. "Every transaction, every lie, every time you claimed my inheritance was lost or gone. The truth doesn't lie, Susan." Her lips parted, ready to argue, but no words came. The proof I had collected over months was undeniable. Notarized receipts, hidden accounts, legal documents, all exposing her greed and pretense. She had taken what was mine not out of need, but because she wanted to assert control, to keep me in a corner of shame while she paraded as the caring mother. The room's atmosphere shifted. Whispers rose quietly, family members exchanging glances, piecing together what had been hidden for years. Even my youngest cousin leaned forward, eyes wide, sensing the silent collapse of Susan's carefully curated image. Susan's face went pale. Her smile lasted less than a minute, replaced by the rigid mask of someone desperately trying to maintain dignity. But no mask could hide the truth. And I, sitting calmly, felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. Justice was unfolding exactly as I had planned, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The envelope's contents had started the chain reaction, and by the time the night was over, Susan's carefully maintained control would be shattered completely. Susan sank into the armchair, rigid, as family members slowly returned to their gifts, pretending to ignore the storm unfolding beside the tree. I watched her, noting the subtle twitch in her jaw, the way her hands fidgeted with the papers. She was trying to reclaim composure, but the truth weighed on her like an anchor. I just don't understand, she whispered, almost to herself. The room's silence was deafening. No one offered reassurance. No one defended her. Every whispered lie she had told over the years, how she claimed the inheritance was lost, spent, or inaccessible, was now exposed. The documents proved otherwise. I stayed calm, letting the weight of reality settle around her. It wasn't lost, I said quietly. It was never gone. You hid it, Susan. You kept what was mine while pretending to protect me. Her eyes darted around, desperate for an excuse, a loophole, any fragment of sympathy. But the evidence left none. Each family member now saw the pattern, the controlling behavior, the constant undermining, the hidden greed. And for the first time, Susan was forced to confront how small and powerless her past manipulations had truly made her feel. By the end of the evening, her pride was no longer intact. I had given her the gift she never expected, transparency. And the realization settled in her chest like ice. She could never undo what had been revealed. The next morning, the tension hadn't eased. Susan barely touched her coffee, eyes flitting nervously across the room. I spent my time reviewing my notes quietly, letting her anxiety grow naturally. Patience was part of the plan. Her desperation was a signal that the fallout was real. I don't know why you're doing this, she muttered finally, voice low and trembling. It's Christmas. You shouldn't humiliate me like this. I smiled softly. It's not humiliation. It's accountability, I said. You treated what was mine as if it didn't matter. You lied, you manipulated, and you thought no one would notice. But I did. And now everyone knows. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her arrogance, the same arrogance that had fueled her for years, was cracking. She had assumed I would accept her control silently, but she underestimated my patience and my preparation. Each moment of quiet tension fed the inevitability of her downfall. Even without raising my voice, the room was mine. The subtle glances exchanged between family members confirmed it. They had all sensed the quiet reversal of power. And Susan, usually the center of attention, now sat isolated, aware that the tables had turned completely. By midday, the effect of the previous night had rippled outward. Cousins whispered in corners, aunts exchanged knowing glances, and even the neighbors who dropped by later felt the undercurrent of tension. Susan tried to maintain her facade, but every smile was forced, every gesture mechanical. I approached her quietly, handing back the envelope she had struggled with the night before. Read it carefully, I said. Everything is documented. You hid nothing from yourself, but the truth no longer hides from anyone else. Her fingers shook as she opened it, and I could see the panic blooming in her eyes. Each page was a mirror of her deceit, each signature a silent witness to her greed. She had always believed she controlled the narrative, but the narrative had changed. Quietly, painfully, and irrevocably. She looked up at me then, a flicker of something between fear and regret. The arrogance was gone. What remained was the hollow awareness that the game she thought she had won had already been lost. And in that moment, I knew the next act would be hers to crumble completely, no shouting, no chaos, just the clean, unstoppable truth. By late afternoon, whispers had spread beyond the living room. A few relatives had discreetly checked the documents for themselves, nodding subtly as pieces of the betrayal fell into place. Susan noticed their glances and stiffened. Her carefully constructed image of composure was fracturing. I don't understand why you're showing this to everyone, she said, voice strained. This is private. I leaned back calmly, letting her anxiety fill the space. Privacy doesn't matter when the truth has been ignored for years, I said. You treated what was mine as though it was yours to manipulate, and now everyone sees it. She tried to interrupt, but each word stumbled against the evidence laid before her. Every envelope, every note, every account entry revealed the pattern of her greed, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, then blatant over time. The family's disbelief morphed into quiet outrage, and Susan realized for the first time that her lies couldn't shield her. Her hands trembled, betraying the panic she tried to mask. That day, Susan learned something crucial. Control could be taken without a word raised, without confrontation, and without theatrics. I had orchestrated it perfectly, and she was powerless to reverse it. Evening arrived, and the tension in the house was palpable. Susan avoided my gaze, pretending to be busy with decorations, while everyone else moved cautiously, aware that the quiet storm was far from over. Then came the subtle moment of reckoning. My youngest cousin, who had been quietly observing, leaned over and whispered, "Emily, she's never been honest about any of this, right?" I shook my head. "Not once," I said softly, letting the words sink in. Susan's ears twitched, her panic barely contained. She had always assumed I would stay silent, that her manipulation would remain invisible. But the witnesses, the documents, and my calm composure made the betrayal undeniable. Her usual quick-witted retorts, the sharp defenses she wielded for years, had no effect. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Each glance, each small act, each verified document worked like a slow-acting poison, quiet, unavoidable, irreversible. By the end of the evening, my mom realized she had lost not just the inheritance she coveted but the illusion of control she had relied on for decades. Night fell, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet. I found Susan alone in the study, clutching the final envelope, her knuckles white. "Emily, please," she said, voice trembling. "Can't we just forget this?" I shook my head gently. "No, Mom. Forgetting doesn't undo what you did. And hiding it didn't make it yours." Her shoulders slumped. Her arrogance, the trait that had fueled her throughout life, was gone. For the first time, she looked small, stripped of the pretense she had used to control everyone around her. I left her there, alone with the truth. Not humiliated in front of everyone, not forced to shout or scream, just confronted by reality in its purest form. She had been exposed, cleanly and irrevocably, and there was no recovering the power she thought she held. By the time I returned to the living room, the quiet aftershock of her collapse had rippled outward. The family no longer whispered about her gifts or her charm, they whispered about the truth she had tried to bury and failed. The next morning, Susan attempted a quiet recovery strategy. She spoke to family members individually, trying to plant seeds of doubt, implying I had overreacted, that perhaps the documents were misinterpreted. Her voice was sweet, her tone careful, but the damage was done. Each attempt backfired. Cousins, aunts, and uncles quietly compared notes. The more she spoke, the more her inconsistencies became glaring. "Emily is being reasonable," whispered one relative. "Everything is written down. Susan can't deny it now." I watched from the kitchen doorway, sipping coffee, calm. Susan's panic grew in silence. Every whisper meant less control for her. She had underestimated not just me, but the power of patience, of meticulous preparation. She realized too late, subtle manipulation couldn't undo months of careful planning. By lunchtime, she sat quietly at the table, eyes darting for allies. There were none. The very family she had relied on to support her greed now quietly rallied around the truth. Afternoon brought a small gathering to wrap the last gifts. Susan tried one final move, publicly reminding everyone of her past generosity, her sacrifices, her self-proclaimed role as the devoted mother. I smiled lightly, letting her perform. Then, without raising my voice, I handed the final undeniable document to our eldest cousin. The room went silent. Susan's expression froze, half panic, half disbelief. "This shows everything," I said softly, letting the words linger. "Every time you claimed generosity, it was a mask. Every gift, every gesture, carefully calculated to keep what was never yours." The room was still. The betrayal was now visible to everyone, crystal clear, beyond any manipulation or excuse. Susan's attempts to rewrite history collapsed in real time. The power she thought she wielded? Gone. Night fell again, and the quiet storm had not abated. Susan withdrew to her room, avoiding the family entirely. I followed later with a simple gesture, a small, neatly wrapped envelope left at her bedside. Inside was a single, clear statement: all accounts reconciled, all evidence of her deceit documented, all privileges restored to their rightful place. No accusation, no gloating, just justice quietly executed. Susan read it, hands trembling, eyes wide. No words escaped. She realized that her arrogance, her belief in invincibility, had been her undoing. The irony was deliciously quiet. She had orchestrated so many attempts to humiliate me over the years, yet it took nothing more than calm preparation, patience, and evidence to reverse the roles completely. By the time I returned to the living room, the family had settled into a rare silence, each member reflecting on what had happened. Susan's downfall was complete, irreversible, and quietly devastating. The evening passed without a single dramatic outburst, yet her defeat was more powerful than any scene of shouting could have been. The next morning, Christmas morning light poured through the windows, illuminating the living room. Susan remained in her room, silent. I decided to deliver one final act, not of gloating but of closure. I gathered the family in the living room. Everyone watched as I handed each person a copy of the ledger, every hidden transaction, every misappropriated gift, every lie documented. No words of anger, just clear evidence. Susan peeked around the corner, pale, trapped by the undeniable truth. Her past authority over the family had evaporated completely. There was no shouting, no screaming, just a quiet, shared realization. She had lost, and it was irreversible. The family, once complicit in her performance, now quietly nodded in understanding. Her manipulation had crumbled under its own weight, leaving her isolated in the corner of the room, powerless, while I stood calm, collected, and unshaken. Later that day, the final moment arrived. I approached Susan's bedroom door with a small gift, a symbol of closure rather than revenge. Inside was a framed letter, a record of her betrayal, but also a note of forgiveness. She took it, hands shaking, and for the first time, her facade cracked entirely. There were no tears of joy, no triumphant screams, just the raw, painful realization of every wrong she had committed. I never thought," she whispered, voice breaking. But there was no continuation, no excuse, no defense. The truth had spoken louder than any argument she could muster. I left the room quietly, feeling the weight lift from years of tension. The gift was simple, but its impact was irreversible. Her smile, once so smug, was gone. And the family, now united in clarity and justice, finally had peace. That evening, the house was calm. Christmas lights twinkled faintly, a stark contrast to the storm that had passed. I sat by the fireplace, a cup of tea in hand, reflecting on the months of preparation, patience, and careful planning. Justice had been delivered without chaos, without cruelty, only through careful timing, quiet observation, and undeniable evidence. Susan, once dominant and dismissive, had been quietly undone by her own arrogance. The final gift she would ever receive from me was the truth, and the lesson that greed and deception cannot withstand patience, preparation, and calm resolve. The holiday ended not with drama, but with closure, peace, and the quiet satisfaction that justice, when executed wisely, can be the most powerful gift of all.